Hello, soul family. Today I have a very exciting guest. Her name is Isabella. She's a really close friend of mine and she is an astrologer. She's gonna help me dive into everything astrology today. We're gonna try to talk about as many details and cover as many topics as possible. We're gonna dive into houses and what they are, to your rising sign and the importance of that. And we're even gonna dive a little bit into compatibility and synestry so that you can reflect on that with your partner or your friends or whoever you want. So without further ado, this is Isabella, and tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about how you got into astrology.
I practice traditional tropical astrology for the most part. I kind of have always been into like spirituality and like astrology since I was like in 7th grade. I was only really into like my sun sign. And then about 2 years ago, I met one of my like best friends. She introduced me to like reading birth charts and stuff, and I just decided to look into it more, and it just kind of went on from there. I started to practice and read my own chart. I watched like a bunch of YouTube videos and I read a bunch of books and I studied my chart, and then I started to look at my parents' charts and my siblings' charts and my friends' charts, and I started comparing our charts and how certain things are being reflected. And it's crazy too, because I would read like everybody I met, I would read their chart, and then I would just like, oh, you're probably like this, or you do this, and and they're just like,
how do you know?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and you'll start to see like which people you're attracting and the patterns and how like they react very similarly when they have similar planets. It's very interesting how connected everything is.
Let's dive into the first basic. So what is your big three?
It typically means your sun, moon, and rising. So your sun is typically, it's your ego, your identity, your values. It's almost the person you're trying to become. Your moon sign's your most inner reactions. A lot of people say it's your inner emotions, how you react to things.
Yeah.
And then your rising sign is the sign that was rising in the eastern horizon when you were born. It's the sign that rules the first house of the rest of your chart, because you have 12 houses and it sets the tone for the rest of your chart.
And you need the exact birth time for your rising sign.
Yes. Your rising signs are very time sensitive. The rising signs will change every 2 hours because obviously the earth is always moving.
If you're like me and you do not know your birth time, and maybe there's like no way of ever knowing that, don't fret, because you can still learn a ton of your chart and all of this information without the birth time. So even if you're a little bit like vague on what your rising sign is, there's still important aspects in the rest of your chart.
Yeah, it is off a 2-hour
span.
Your rising sign's probably more you than your sun sign is, which is kind of like a very popular misconception. Your rising sign rules like your personality and how you look, like your physical appearance. Any planets, any aspects you have can affect the way that you look.
I always like to think that your rising sign is kind of who you were as a kid, and your sun sign is more like who you're growing into. Because like if I was a Gemini rising, which I think I am, I was way more talkative and extroverted and social as a kid than I am now as a growing Pisces. So while we talk about rising signs, what would you say is like the most important thing about rising signs, and why are they so important?
They're really important because they set the tone for the rest of your chart. They're different aspects of life. So you can see where there's emphasis, right? So for you, you have a Pisces stellium in your 10th house of career. So there's a lot of emphasis on career and job, and it has to do with spirituality because it's in Pisces, and Pisces is a very spiritual sign. You have your Jupiter, your sun.
Yeah, I have a lot of Pisces.
Yeah, and I think, what else do you have?
Mars.
Yeah, so you have like a lot of ambition and growth and expansion, so much possibility, so much like, especially with your sun, which just brightens everything up for you. So it's very, it can be very, very beneficial.
She's gonna call me out in this video, okay? Just be warned. So I got my chart here, guys, and this lovely, amazing astrologer is going to dive into it a little bit and use it as an example. So all these little symbols and aspects, what even is that, right? Like, how am I supposed to understand that? Let's go into trines, squared, start wherever you want to start.
Well, we can start from the good versus the quote-unquote bad, okay?
Mhm.
They're not bad.
It's all open to interpretation.
It's all open to interpretation. It's more challenging.
Yeah.
So, okay, so for more beneficial aspects, so aspects are, like I said, the conversations at which your planets are having based on degrees. So for sextile is basically where two planets, when they're in sextile, they're having the best conversation. They're getting along so well. They work so well together. It's very harmonious. Trine is when they're at 45-degree planets. It's when 3 planets are trining. And same thing, very harmonious, very much working together to balance each other out. Then there's conjunction, where basically planets are on top, and I think 3 degrees ahead or behind a planet. I believe it's that, but definitely when they're on top of each other, very similar, having pretty good conversation. It can be cute, sometimes it can be a little spicy, you know what I mean? But it's not super bad. It just depends on the planets. Oh, so squared is when 2 planets are not getting along at all. They are they're like this, right? So when one's happy, one is being satisfied, the other is struggling, is dying, right? So for an example,
I have some squared. I don't have a lot, but I have some squared.
You know what? Your Chiron, that's interesting. Your Chiron, so Chiron is an asteroid, and that kind of delves more into wounds, you know, things that you struggle to understand, things
what
that
you need to heal in this lifetime. Which
is interesting that it's in, that it squares your Jupiter. So you have a really hard time with, like, there's this open wound around expansion and growth. There's this, like, struggle, especially within Capricorn, and all these Pisces placements. Like there's like a struggle, there's like a resistance or an open wound towards money, towards career and expansion. You know, there's this need maybe to be small and wanting to keep it small, and and because maybe expansion is a little too much, it's too scary, especially with Jupiter and Capricorn. It can struggle, it can be challenging because Jupiter wants to grow. It wants to be out here, and Capricorn is like, no. It's very traditional. It's very structured. You have to do it this way. Exactly. And with Chiron squaring it, there's just this, like, it's coming from a place of, like, fear, maybe, or maybe a not so good relationship with money. Right?
So this is why astrology is so real, because I literally have ancestral trauma on my father's side that relates and corresponds to my Jupiter being in Capricorn, because he also shares a Jupiter in Capricorn. So that's very interesting that would be squared to my Chiron with wounds. It's like this is mapping out stuff I already knew.
Yeah, definitely. You know, I have a Venus squared Mars, so there's this battle between going after my goals and careers and what really will satisfy me versus nourishing and nurturing my relationships with the people I decide to date and things like that. So there's a struggle, there's a back and forth between that. You know, when I'm so focused on my relationships, my goals kind of fall to the side. When I'm so focused on my goals, my relationships fall to the side, you know? Well, your moon and your sun are trine, which is pretty harmonious, and I'm pretty sure that also goes with your Mercury. Yeah, they trine, so your emotions with your identity and the way that you communicate those things are very in tuned. Like, I think we talked about this earlier, you have a very good like energetic throat chakra.
Oh yeah.
You know, it's very just open.
Speaking the truth, like speaking my truth.
Venus and Mercury sextile, I feel like communication and relationships like is very important.
Oh yeah,
It's super
I say
important.
that's in the big three of like things that are required for a healthy relationship is communication.
Definitely.
100%.
Definitely. And you have no problem communicating the things that you need, you know, that'll satisfy that'll help and your identity, right? If you want to look more deeply, you can look into your chart rulers.
Yeah.
So each sign is ruled by a planet. So for an example, like Mercury rules Gemini and Virgo, right? So when you have Gemini in the first house, Mercury rules that first house. But the first house is you, and you are that whole chart. So Mercury would be your chart ruler.
A misconception, I would say, is that being ruled by a planet does not mean you are good at those aspects.
Yes, a great example is a Leo rising with more than 2 or 3 squared placements on your sun, right? So Leo risings are natural born leaders. People naturally will look to them as to what to do. And if you have squared aspects to your sun, your chart ruler, that can come out very bossy, very dictator, very much I want what I want,
top.
very much bulldozing, and and those would be qualities that you would need to reflect on and watch out for.
There's the shadow sides.
So squares, they're challenges. So for someone like me, most of my aspects are squares, which can be really difficult because I've said this to you before, where 2 truths can be true at a time, you know? Like I like luxurious things, but I also want to live a very minimalist life. So it can be a struggle to find that balance.
Conflicting ideas, but they both exist and they both matter.
Exactly. Squared placements, I feel like although they're so challenging, can be super beneficial, like in the long run, because you're able to fully understand yourself and you found that balance, whereas somebody who has a bunch of sextiles where that came more naturally, they're probably less aware of their more negative aspects or their flaws.
Houses. Are you ready for houses?
Yeah.
Let's dive into houses. What are the houses? What does that even mean? Houses are ruled by certain signs or planets?
So houses, they're, like I said before, they're different aspects of your life. Your first 6 houses have to do with you. The second 6 houses, so 7 through 12, have to do with the people in your life. Your rising sign, right? The first house, you, your personality, your appearance, how you look, anything in that first house, anything that's aspecting your ascendant is going to affect the way that you look and the way that you present yourself to people. Then you have your second house, which is possessions, how your security, like how you make your money, and kind of where you're most comfortable, you know, it kind of rules like cars and houses and things like that. Then you have your third house, which has to do with your siblings, your relationship with your siblings. It has to do with communication and intellect. Your fourth house has to do with your childhood. It also can be loosely related to your mother, but mostly your childhood, your family. And then your fifth house is a very fun house. It's all about romance and fun and sex and playful. Then your sixth house is more mundane. It's more the mundane things that go on in your life, your physical health. A lot of Virgo risings, they tend to have a lot of physical health problems because the sixth house is, because Virgo rules that house, and having that in your first house can affect your body. A lot, like I think Kurt Cobain, he's like a Virgo rising, and he was known for having really bad stomach problems too. Seventh house, now we go into other people, right? So seventh house goes into long-term relationships, partnerships, business partnerships, contracts, marriage, things like that. Eighth house has to do with other people's money, right? So inheritances, the occult. It can also kind of represent like death in a way. A lot of people with those planets, if you have like Sinistry, like people will joke that you have like suicide pacts with those people. Like, yeah, when you have 8th house Sinistry. 9th house has to do with education and travel. 10th house has to do with careers and your reputation. And then that's where midheaven is, which is the highest point of your chart. And that rules like how you present yourself publicly and probably like what you put on social media, that kind of stuff. The 11th house is your network, your group of friends, how you make connections. And your 12th house is all about your subconscious.
I think there also is a little bit aspect of the 12th house that is like intuitive gifts.
Yes, gifts, definitely. If you have 12th house placements, you'll tend to have psychic gifts. You'll be like, my son's in the 12th house and I'm super into astrology and tarot card readings.
My Venus is in the 12th house and I love love and I'm all about love.
Aries is naturally in the first house and then it goes Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, so on and so forth, right? So then obviously...
So Pisces rules the 12th house.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah. So each sign rules those houses, right? So Aries risings, like their tone is actually set pretty good, especially if they have a lot of good aspects, because everything is in order. Like every sign, every element is exactly where it's supposed to be. So Aries risings, Leo risings, and Sagittarius risings tend to be a lot more lucky or more looked at maybe. And same with air risings. So air risings are like the second best that you can have, because now the elements are in compatible elements houses, right? So fire and air go super well with each other. So you have an air sign and a fire ruled house, and an earth sign and a water ruled house, or water and an earth ruled house, and stuff like that. So it goes on like that. Then earth and water is where things kind of start to struggle a little bit, because now you have opposite elements in opposite houses that are being ruled by, signs. So those can be more challenging.
I'm ready to go into Sinistry.
Oh, my favorite part.
A little bit. Sinistry. So you could do our Sinistry.
A lot of mainstream media has a misconception about compatibility in terms of astrology. So a lot of people think like, oh, Scorpios and Aquariuses, they don't get along, or certain signs don't get along. That's not necessarily true. When we look at Sinistry, we're looking at, it's basically when you put your chart on top of somebody else's chart and you're looking at how their planets are aspecting, what conversations are their planets having with your planets, where are their planets landing in your houses, where are your planets landing in their houses, and how are those being reflected in real life, and how can you use them to your advantage. It's not necessarily are we compatible, it's how are we compatible. So you're switching up the conversation.
Or how aren't we?
Exactly. What challenges may we have,
So let's dive in a little bit with some examples.
Well, you have a Pisces stellium in my 10th house. So we are very compatible in terms of, you could help me a lot with career, right? So I could learn a lot from you in terms of career and how things work and what, like, you could help me with a lot of ideas and connections and things like that. The struggle with that, though, is it squares my Gemini and Sagittarius placements. So I have 3 planets in Gemini. And
so what would that challenge?
Some things that you may be teaching me about career may go against how I want to present myself to the world. It may struggle with my emotions and my drive. I have a fire Mars, so I'm like, I gotta go. I gotta push it all out. And what advice she gave me was, sometimes it's better to just let it happen and do nothing. That was such a great example of her Pisces Saturn squaring my Sagittarius Mars, where she's just like, just go with the flow.
Do the opposite.
Let it come with you. And I was like, really? Are you sure about that? And what's great about that is we can look at that and I can go, okay.
So she could choose to be triggered by me conflicting her beliefs and being like, you don't even know what you're talking about. Why would I just sit and do nothing? Or knowing astrology and knowing that that's what's happening, she can look above and look at the bigger picture and say, I see that she's gonna oppose that, but I also see that she's gonna help me.
Because having that, like having her stellium in my 10th house is extremely beneficial to my career. especially with Jupiter going to Pisces right now.
Woo, Jupiter Pisces!
It's in its home sign. She's doing good for everybody. It squares most of my chart, you know, so those are challenges that we would
They're coming to light.
That are coming to light. But I feel like we're very developed. She's a very developed Pisces sun, you know, Scorpio moon, Gemini rising, and I feel like I'm pretty developed Taurus sun, Sagittarius moon. So I can recognize the challenges and the like opposing opinions and say, okay, let me reflect on that and how can I make that work where it feels comfortable for me. But
it's all about growth.
And you know what? It wasn't bad advice. It worked. It helped a lot. You know what I mean? So it's also putting your ego down and putting your pride away and just recognizing that.
I'm so glad. Say if we were like dating or something just because of this, how would that go based on our Venuses and what's conjunct? And
so any placements that you have in the 12th house, any synestry that they have in the 12th house, it's natural for the planet native to tap into the subconscious of the house person. And it can be easy to manipulate and have power over the house person, right? So also I like to look at moon signs as well.
I mean, for relationships is also Mercury because communication.
For an example, any 7th house synestry, 5th house synestry. So 5th house synestry is fun, romance, it's playful, it's like summer flings. That's kind of what that reminds me of. So if you have like
naive, but
so like Venus Mars 5th house synestry is so fun and like it's fun. But 7th house synestry, that's like marriage. That's like, this person is perfect for me. Moon in the 1st house synestry can be really good for like emotional connection because the moon person will feel like emotionally very connected to the house person, and it'll be really easy to open up, right? Because the house person is so familiar with these emotions that it's going to be easy for them to accept that familiar energy that they themselves are, right? Any 4th house synestry though, y'all, 4th house synestry and 5th house synestry has a great deal to do with like pregnancy as well.
Oh,
so
wow.
If you have Venus and Mars in the 4th house, that's
interesting.
That's also like family. That's like that person can get you pregnant.
Wow.
And 5th house rules children as well.
Yeah.
So with your children, you'll have 5th house synestry with them.
Interesting. So as we close down into this, let's leave with just the little cherries on top for wisdom. So my little piece that I would like to share is about the North Node and the South Node. Learning astrology and learning about the North Node, I was able to learn kind of what I suck at, right? So like the things that I'm really not good at, and then the things that I'm way too good at and I kind of scapegoat into my comfort zone, right? So having a North Node in Libra would mean that maybe I'm not so good at being diplomatic. I could struggle with communicating and being too like aggressive or assertive and having that not be understood and read the right way. And having a South Node in Aries means I'm so comfortable going back to being alone, so comfortable focusing on me, not focusing on anybody else. And then realizing that, so that's part of the reason that I got into doing tarot reading from the beginning, was I thought I needed to help people and communicate in a diplomatic, peaceful way where they can understand what I'm saying, instead of being like, girl, dump him, fuck that guy, right? Like being peaceful and loving and compassionate with what I'm saying and being understood. So North Node and South Node is definitely lessons. If you want to start with a lesson, I think that's a great place to start, just for a way to reflect on something that you need to work on.
Definitely.
What would your little cherry on top, so I know you mentioned how a lot of people start getting into astrology right now through TikTok and Twitter, and there is good information on there, but what would your advice be about that?
Don't let that information be your end-all be-all, because there's a lot of misinformation. So definitely do your research. Start small. You know, first understand the houses, the aspects, and the planets, and then study your chart. Study your chart.
Yeah.
Look at how certain aspects and planets and things like that are being emphasized or reflected in your life, and then start looking at other people's charts and start just researching. And I would read, like, for me, I read books, I watched YouTube videos on like my rising sign. I watched so many, and a lot of them had the same information, and those pieces of information that rung true, I was like, oh, you know, start with your own chart, start with you, and then you move on to other people.
If someone on TikTok says that an Aquarius and a Leo are not compatible, don't just take that like it's a fact.
Yeah.
There's so much that plays
But there's
into
so
it.
much that plays into it. There's so much with synestry, and it's a little bit more, it's fun. It's a lot more complicated than people think it is. It's not as simple as the sun signs.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so be careful with misinformation and just do your own research and just
Take your
practice.
time. It's not a race.
Yeah, it's its own language. So think about it like that. It's its own language. It has...
Yeah, it takes time to learn Japanese, just like it takes time to learn astrology.
Exactly. If you're willing to put in time, though, it becomes simple, becomes easy.
And then you start speaking it just like if it was a language. That's amazing. So I want to thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
All the wisdom.